I was kind of speechless when I saw this motion. I think it is very clear that social media has ruined men's interpersonal relationships, and I'm legitimately proud to propose. I'm going to explain the scope of the round, and then I'll explain how this leads to less healthy and deep real-life interactions and friendships, and how this leads to more toxicity and competition between men and women on the whole. Firstly, on the scope of the round. So this is about all of men's interpersonal relationships, their friendships, their relationships with their family, and their romantic relationships. Second piece of framing is what is a good relationship? Well, a good relationship is a relationship that is good. But what that probably means is that it is not just a relationship that on a surface level makes you feel some kind of pleasure. You could just, I don't know, press a button for that, something like that. Rather, a good relationship is one with diverse experiences, one with where two people know each other's inside jokes, coffee orders where they make each other feel comfortable and help each other grow and become better as people and achieve more of their goals and be more true to themselves. Finally, the influence of social media is one that starts at a very, very young age. This shouldn't be contested. What did the average man's relationships look like before social media? Well, average men before social media went to local schools. They, at a higher rate, went to churches, etc. They lived closer to their families and whatnot. Typically, there were ways that they learned to socialize when they didn't have a phone to look at all the time. That is, when they were children on the school ground, they'd be forced to talk to each other because there's literally nothing else to do. And that's how they had the early experiences of learning to flirt with girls in a silly way in kindergarten, learning to fight with boys and resolve their problems in a low pressure, low stakes environment where their brains are neuroplastic and they're taking in information and they learn those social cues as they go along. How does the average man use social media now? So I want to preempt two things from opposition. The first thing I want to preempt is this like, oh no, poor like loners and gay men and stuff like that who couldn't find friends before they had social media and things like that. So I don't think this is the average man, right? The average man, most men in the world live in normal places. Most men in the world are part of the majority in their population. Most men in the world like average interests, like sports. Okay, well, maybe we'll not go that far. But yeah, most men in the world are average men and not these niche cases where they were hyper-bullied or couldn't have relationships before social media. So how does the average man use social media? Algorithms dictate what content they see. On most social media apps, an algorithm decides what gets pushed to you. What does the algorithm want to maximize? Two things, your time on the social media site, because you are the product. You need to be on the social media site to watch ads, to attract advertisers, to buy things that give portions of the money to the sites. And the second thing they want to maximize are your contributions. So they don't just want you to be sitting there passively and contentedly staring at puppies. They want you to be in the comment section making content for other users to consume. Because again, the network of people and the content that they produce through comment sections, through interactions, is the main product that these social media sites have to offer. And these sites are very hard to regulate into being normal or healthy and whatnot, and empirically regulation has failed in the past. And so what happens is there are two categories of content that the average man sees most frequently on social media. They're both kinds of rage bait. The first kind of rage bait is fascinating, opulent wealth and attractiveness. It is fascinating to the average person to see fun, interesting, pleasurable things that you feel like you wouldn't attain or that you haven't experienced before in regular life. Like, I'm not going to go on social media to look at a dog when I can look at my neighbor's dog. But I am going to go on social media and look at like women flying out to Dubai to hang out with old rich men and eating 17 kinds of oysters, or men with huge mansions and 13 cars and 14 girlfriends, etc. What does this do? This makes the average man feel inadequate, possibly making him lash out, possibly making him more insecure around his friends. But second, and importantly, it turns the average man
Point.
toward the grind set. It turns the average man who is now exposed to all this opulent wealth that he never would have seen before in his normal life and church community, and who's being taunted by these people saying, I'm richer than you, who are flaunting their wealth to try to get engagement with the algorithm, to try to get more followers, etc. The average man turns more towards work, more towards side hustles, and more towards trying to like get money, etc. This worsens his relationships because he has less time to spend going to the bar with his buddies, trying to flirt with women on the side, etc. This is kind of bad. The second category of rage bait that the average man sees frequently on social media is easy explanations or solutions for their problems. That is, if you're a person who lives a kind of miserable life with a shitty 12-hour job or whatever and whatnot, you're turning to social media in those moments when you get home, when you're frustrated and irritated and upset, when you're anxious and want to escape, etc. What happens then is the kinds of people who succeed on social media are grifters and scammers who sell these men content that allegedly allows them to escape from their situation. So when you open the social media app, the thing that your eye stays on, the thing that you watch through to the end and comment on, is the kind of content that says, do you have a shitty job? Are you tired of working 12 hours? course. Good news. We know the problem, and the problem is women, and the solution is take my $70 course, and I'll explain to you how to, like, I don't know, log your annoying sub 5 Karen boss and stop getting scheduled for overtime annoyingly and stuff like that. Easy explanations or solutions that blame other people for men's problems are the second thing that's pushed to them frequently, that they are fascinated and that they stay and watch. What does this mean? First, less healthy and deep IRL interactions. On the comparative, when kids learn socialization in low pressure environments, they have the skills to meet people in real life and to talk to them, to connect with more friends. But now that kids don't learn them at all, now that they scroll on social media on their lunch break and they see these two categories of rage bait all the time, from a young age, men aren't forming friendships, and instead they are going and doing things that make them less likable as people and whatnot. I'll take a POI before protected time ends.
Do you think they go back to church?
Maybe, bro. Yeah, maybe that'd be fine. Like, I don't know, from their perspective, their relationships would be great. Second, though, importantly, any man who had those skills previously loses them. Even if you're older and you didn't grow up on social media, you didn't grow up scrolling instead of roughhousing on the playfield from a young age. Now you are blasted with 7 feeds of reels per day into your head, and you lose the ability, you lose the muscle that you previously used to have normal conversations and give normal responses when someone approaches you in real life. But secondly, and importantly, there's more toxicity and competition. This is perhaps the most important impact in the round. When influencers create a million hierarchies that stretch far beyond what the average man would previously have seen in terms of wealth, in terms of looks, etc. Sure, we agree there would be insecurity in the past because there's like a chat at your school or something like that. But in the past, we had the idea of kind of attractive and kind of not attractive. We didn't have the idea of like the specific hammer you needed to buy to smash the specific bone in your jaw to allegedly maximize your chances of getting women and stuff like that. With these hierarchies and these competitive, toxic environments, and these grifters trying to sell courses to men to convince them women are the problem and to convince them that by becoming a little more manipulative, they can finally have everything they want. This means that men fight with each other more. This means that men fight with women more. And this means that men spend less time with their families. We're incredibly, again, proud to propose.
No.
Good to start whenever?
Mhm.
Okay. Okay, I just want to start with some basic framing on the round, which I think is men are under socialized, and I don't think that's necessarily an aspect of social media. I think that's probably both like temporally and logically prior to the existence and rise of social media. Why is this the case? Because men largely have this like norm of stoicism that's placed onto them. And that's a result of like emotion being seen as like traditionally feminine coded, right? So men often have this wall that they put up that means that they're like unable to like fully engage both like with other, particularly with other men, but then also in their like relationships with women. I think this also manifests in this way where if there's a conflict, especially between men, there's this incentive to reassert that wall and not engage in a vulnerable way because vulnerability is coded as non-masculine, right? And I think this doesn't necessarily come from social media. It comes from like the norms that are in here in like Western society that have like created a lot of toxicity in the way that men engage, right? I think then the question is, how does this change that? I think A, you have greater availability of information regarding what is good and bad because you have greater exposure to like other norms of engagement on social media, right? I think even if like government can be like, yeah, well, you're siloing men into like toxic spaces if they're already toxic. I think what we can say is, well, like at least you're seeing what like your friends are liking, right? If you're on Instagram and you look at like the friend like tab, you're able to see what they like. You're able to see like content that might like exhibit different norms of human engagement than the ones you have, which is likely to at least partially socialize you into those norms just via like osmosis, right? I also just yeah, I think this like engages at least partly with the siloing argument from OG. I think also just to quickly like I think yeah, while there might be like some fringe groups out there, I think people who are likely to find fringe groups are likely to find them on either side of the house. And I think those people are probably unlikely to have like meaningful fulfilling relationships on either side of the house. And whatever harm comes from that is a societal harm, not like an interpersonal relationship harm. Yeah.
I follow Hamza on Instagram. Do you think he's the liking like Instagram infographics about how to be like a vulnerable man and stuff?
No, I don't think he's liking those, but I think when he goes on like the part like the tab of Instagram Reels that shows you what your friends have liked, he might see like other people who he follows liking reels like that. And I think that at least partially like lets him know that there are like other norms of human engagement, or that it's like normal to be vulnerable, and that that's not like a crazy thing, right? Um, okay. Secondly, then on community and why we get a greater ability to access groups of like-minded people. I think that the mechanism here is fairly straightforward, and it's that the algorithm does like push you into content and spaces that it knows you want. It's very good at this, obviously, because social media companies are incentivized to make it good, as this is how they get like the most engagement and they're able to get the most like advertising revenue. I think the question then is, why is this limited under the status quo or like prior to social media? I think A, because of information asymmetry, you can't know like who is into like the stuff that you're into, especially for activities or interests that don't necessarily have like a physical location. Like obviously, if you're into tennis, you go to the tennis court and you meet people who are into tennis. But activities that don't have that necessarily physical character, or like interests that don't have that physical character, you're less likely to meet like-minded people. I think also the other reason it's limited under the status quo or prior to social media is like the decline in third spaces, alienation, or like specific barriers to certain kinds of people, certain kinds of communities in certain areas, like LGBTQ, right? I think I think the question then is like, why are communities of like-minded people important? I think there's probably just have better interpersonal relationships when there's something to talk about, when there's like shared interests. I think that is like the stepping stone to be able to like develop a deeper bond with someone rather than just like a superficial bond that occurs when you just don't have a certain requisite level of like engagement in order to like get into that next level of having a deeper connection. Okay. I agree with government's characterization that probably a good relationship isn't just hedonism and that it's like meaning and diverse experiences, etc. I disagree with government's characterization of what the world looks like before social media. They tell you that the average man before social media was like forced to talk to each other on like school grounds and that this was a low stakes environment. Uh, Two responses to this. One, I think social media is a lower stakes environment because in things like DMs, you're able to like, it allows people who are socially awkward, for example, to engage with other people. And I think both because it's low stakes and because you have the ability to not immediately respond and to take your time and to decide on a response. Also, Lily POIs this, you're not going back to church, right? The decline in third spaces started way before the rise in social media. The idea that we're going to send men back to church is crazy, but also the idea that men's norms of interpersonal relationship were better when they were just like going to church all the time or whatever, like prior to social media is crazy, right? Like in our like recent past of like the entire like 20th century, men's norms of interpersonal engagement were a lot less vulnerable, a lot more guarded, and a lot more like toxic hypermasculinity, right? Jaleelah also tells you, well, you engage with opulent content because it's like a form of rage bait that you're kind of like drawn to in a certain way, which makes you insecure and makes you more likely to lash out and turns the average man towards like the grind set. A, I don't buy on face that the average man is like turned more to like the grind set in recent years. But B, don't you just fantasize about this, but actually like never do anything about it? Because planning for something gives you the same dopamine hit as actually doing something. This is why people are always like, bro, here's what I'm gonna do, and then never do it, right? This is probably just like an outlet for men's fantasies in a world where like everyone's prospects are rapidly like shrinking, right? Then they tell you, well, you lose the ability to have normal conversations because it's a muscle you have to work. Okay, fair. Like, yeah, but in the alternative, you're probably just like playing video games or doing other stuff on your phone precisely because like the material conditions of alienation existed like logically and temporally prior to the existence and rise of social media. And so those things are unlikely to be allayed by social media not existing. You're probably still going to have people withdrawing from physical spaces because like it's gotten a lot less comfortable and there's a lot of like other things that like draw people's attention away and make people like go towards isolation, right? So I don't think that you're likely to like have this resumption of like normal conversations. I also just think again like the way that like men's engagement has worked historically is that those normal conversations, while they may have produced like men who are like slightly more like socially adjusted, also produced men who were like frat boys and like CEOs and like the actual worst men that like the world has maybe ever produced. So I don't know that like that's necessarily a good thing, or that the relationships that were produced through those like social modalities were actually like positive or like fulfilling or meaningful or like on more than like a visceral level. Try to oppose.
Thank you very much. DPM. What's there to
Where's mine? Oh, here it is. Okay, thank you. I guess I will toggle sitting. That's kind of chill. Yeah.
If you want to.
No, it's easier to see my laptop here. Okay, I'll take a POI, ideally from, actually it'll be from anyone. And yeah, just don't like badger me, I guess. And if you're here in person, just raise your hand. Okay. Okay. If the worst case scenario in our world is that these men start just having social lives exclusively through video games, we think that's fine because they are actually getting to talk to each other. They're talking to real people. They're getting to hear social cues about that person's reaction to what they're saying. If they're like gaming on Discord or if they're over the phone, even if they're just texting each other, these are people they have to know in real life if they did not meet them through social media, which is the counterfactual. So therefore, they know that they're real human beings. They develop relationships with them to some extent outside of the internet world, and we think that is comparatively better. It is also our position that social media creates bad social skills and bad interactions. And we believe that even if the counterfactual is less social interaction, obviously not no social interaction. And I will explain why I think third spaces, their decline is linked in many ways to social media, or was at least facilitated by the rise of social media. We think that's comparatively better than worse social interaction. Okay, so first, a few things on why social media is structurally bad, building on what Jaleelah said, because I think we get assertions from opening opposition that this is sort of incidental and like, there are good things on social media and you can have good interactions and you can learn you can see infographics and learn social skills and be exposed to different opinions. So first of all, I mean, algorithms are obviously designed to make you addicted and angry all the time, right? There's an incentive to monopolize your attention, to promote ad revenue, which is how they make money. So the more time you scroll, the more money they can make through their advertisers. There's also an incentive to monopolize engagement because this collects data that then they also feed to advertisers, another way that they make money. And this means that the way that we monopolize engagement the easiest is by getting people really rage baited and angry in all the ways that Jaleelah told you. Also, again, obviously big tech is hard to regulate. This was explained to you. And we, status quo, this is a relatively backward looking motion as I understand it. Little to no regulation exists. The market doesn't solve because network effects limit competition. So when a new competitor actually emerges very rarely, like, I don't know, when Twitter, which still exists and is used, but was brought down by Musk, Blue Sky emerges. But this is actually worse, if anything, because you have, again, the nature of network effects is you need everyone on one site in order to have the value of being on that site, right? Because the whole point of social media is having the social network. Therefore, you end up, when you actually do have that splintering, it's usually for ideological or cultural reasons where something like X now becomes effectively a far right echo chamber and Blue Sky becomes a far left echo chamber, or at least a liberal echo chamber, because that's the only or primary way they pull users away from other platforms. What does this actually mean? I'm about to get into what makes good relationships, but in short, one thing that makes good relationships is learning how to interact with people, learning how to handle disagreement, learning how to handle conflict, learning how to handle big emotions, right? These are things that you do not learn. In fact, you learn the opposite of it when the types of interactions you're exposed to are fundamentally rage baiting or people in an echo chamber where someone expresses slight disagreement and everyone responds by saying, like, this is problematic and it's not my job to educate you. And like, you need to go Google this because I can't explain it to you. That's what happens when you don't have diversity in these spaces. So let's explain why men don't use social media as a stepping stone to real relationships. And in doing so, I'm going to tell you what makes good relationships. I think I'm qualified to say this because I have 2 long-term relationships. Okay, 0 breakups. Look at that record. And it's not just romantic, right? Friendship as well. So good relationships require the ability to resolve conflict. I mentioned that, to be able to communicate when you're online. You don't see the person's face. You lose the ability to understand that the person you're talking to has theory of mind and is a real human being and has feelings and an entire internal world. And so you say things that you otherwise wouldn't say. Like, we've all been there, in the heyday of early debating social media, I was on Can posting some crazy shit, right? Things that you look back on and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe you said that, once you step outside and interact with people. But the problem is that that's also happening at a formative age where you're learning how to interact with people, and you're unlikely to have a way to go out and interact with people if you feel like the most baseline social itch is scratched because you're spending, first of all, your time is used up on these sites. Again, they are designed to make you spend tons of time there. Your friend circle is online, right? This is like pretty common these days for young people. I teach young boys, so again, qualified to talk on what ruins their relationships. You can also, in terms of self-esteem, right? You can be bullied in person, sure, and feel alone. That's bad. Many of us have been there probably. But guess what? We all joined debate club because we were like, we're maybe nerds who were not the popular kids. And maybe we were bullied by the popular kids. So we found a community within our real life space, like our high school, where we joined the mathletes, or you make, a friend group. Maybe it's at church, maybe it's through family friends, maybe it's just through the neighbor on your street because your parent is like, when you're not stuck on a screen, it's easier to push you outside and say, hey, go throw a ball around. And you see the other kid out there who also was forced to throw a ball around and you have to interact. And you're not constantly afraid of how you're going to come off to people and whether they'll be really mad if you say something offensive because you are not social media brained and how you've learned to communicate. And yeah, social media involves constant comparison, as Jaleelah told you, rage baiting, it preys on your insecurities. Yes, Grant.
But social media widens like the world that you're able to engage with. If I hadn't seen a post of debate like advertising opening of the house, I would have probably never went to my first
You
debate
get
meeting.
posters on walls. Like, I think that you can have word of mouth. Again, like this is social media has sort of become our go-to place. People have an incentive for all the reasons they told you to, find spaces where they can connect to each other, going back to third spaces. Third spaces were the decline of third spaces was stopped way less when people were satisfied or placated by being able to go online and have what felt like superficially social interaction, where they lose, again, those muscles that required them to actually build difficult real life relationships. Good relationships also require an understanding of the other person. So this is not just about incels, right? Straight men rarely get to have deep interactions with women in real life when they are growing up on social media. It's like a brief interactions in your classroom. And when they do, they view them through the lens of what they hear on social media about women and they filter that. So this is also the case for all kinds of relationships. This is one case study, right? You likely turn off those women from interacting with you deeply in the first place because they have seen the stereotype of young men. And in fact, they're in their own social echo chambers on social media where they see young men being the most awful stereotype of misogyny. So therefore, they see there's a greater gap between what people imagine women want and what women actually want, because men spend so much time surrounded by other men, or if they interact with women, it's not on social media. This is also just true between people, but especially through genders. That means that you get less romantic relationships. Men are single for long periods of time. They blame this on women. Also, yes, they probably get like advertisements on the counterfactual, but influencer advertising is uniquely bad because it has the ability to make it seem like it's not just a brand that's shouting at you. It's like a real person. He's your friend. You should listen to him. And that means that it's way more persuasive. Also, video games are fine. Algorithms are bad. You're not going to learn things from other people because they deprioritize stuff that you're not likely to watch. So even though you have friends on social media, you are not seeing the stuff from those friends before you're seeing misogynist content or whatever, like crap content. Social media infographics are built for people who already believe them, so they're not going to be persuasive to you, even if you see them. At the end of the day, this is a worse world. Men don't know how to interact with anyone today. Sorry, guys.
All right, well, thank you very much. Oh. Actually,
Wait. 1 sec. Want to turn the computer over? Yeah. Okay, hello. Oh, this is recording, isn't it? Oh, okay. Okay. When you're a man and you make a new Instagram account and you put your name as like John or like, I don't know, fucking Simon or Parker or some shit, it knows that you're a man and it will instantly start showing you reels and posts of like half naked women and cars, even if you have not interacted with anything. This is, I think, uniquely bad and probably stunts men in many ways. Two things. The first is that we're going to talk about social media and how it encourages like these kinds of like harmful ideas in a way that I think maybe and hopefully goes past what OG does. And then secondly, we're going to tell you why it actually leads to worse reinforcement mechanisms and subsequently worse reinforcement of bad social skills for the majority of men who engage on social media. So I think the first thing is just that social media is uniquely good at pushing harmful alternatives to, maybe like, more normal ideas of like,
like masculine friendship and whatnot. The first reason is that there's kind of a lack of ability to moderate. So a lot of vile shit gets put on social media, but there's kind of a lack of moderators and also, advertisement and stuff. And so there's just kind of a lot of content that gets put out there that isn't, removed or whatever. The second thing is just that traditional masculinity. So things like being a provider for your wife and kids or whatever is kind of like a narrative that is becoming less accessible to the vast majority of men. So lots of people, like youth who are growing up or whatever, are trying to seek an alternative for this and, kind of get a sense of direction for this. The problem then is that these massive companies kind of have a lot of data on you. They buy data from your Google searches. They know that men demographically and statistically are more likely to engage when they see a certain kind of media. So they're most likely going to show you, like, the fucking Lamborghini MLM scheme when they see that you are a man or you are in a certain age group that needs this. And so the problem is then is that they're going to show it to the people who are most vulnerable to this kind of thing. They have your data, they're going to need it. And so this also means that there's going to be no kind of pushback mechanism, right? That they're not showing this content to the women or like the base wokies who would go into the comments and tell you why the Lamborghini MLM scheme is bad. They're going to show to people who are susceptible to the scheme and actually agree with it in the comments. So people are going to see this. They don't get the pushback that OO tells you you're going to get, and thus they're more likely to engage with more of this content the moment they engage with one. I engage with like one post about like fucking machinery, and now my entire Reels feed is just like, like fucking heavy duty machinery. That's probably not good. The third thing is just that it shows you content that's like most similar to you. So if it sees that you're interacting with, a certain kind of comment, and you're liking those kinds of comments, it'll show you content that is more similar to that. So, and I think that's probably, how this kind of occurs and sustains itself over time. I think Jaleelah tells you that like the kinds of gold Dubai like wealth schemes are things that men otherwise would not have seen in the counterfactual without social media. I don't know if this is like necessarily like a go-to mechanism because you still see like rich people on TV, you still see this kind of opulent wealth in certain displays. The difference is that when you are seeing those kinds of things, you don't have access to like the accessible Instagram discussion comments that tell you like, yes, this is so base, following this MLM scheme changed my life. Those are the kinds of things that you do not get when you're engaging with other kinds of content. And so the reason why it is so uniquely harmful to men and that like their development of like this kind of thing is because of that. The second thing is just that there's cringe culture that forces men to believe they must act a certain way when you're not like maybe that like socially goaded or whatever, and you see content of people getting filmed and mocked for being like vulnerable or talking about their feelings or crying, and you see comments where people are mean because they can be anonymous and mean. It just means that you see those be millions of likes and you're more afraid to do that kind of behavior because you want to be mobbed and you want to be liked. I think that's normal. You see your friends liking those reels, so you think that, oh, my friend, I must not do this like behavior, be myself in front of your friends. This is bad because it means that you're less able to find people who would otherwise make you feel fulfilled. When you meet someone, you do not behave in a way that is reflective of your preferences are. If they make a joke that is slightly off color, you do not comment on it because you think that that's going to be cringe and you think they're going to not want to be friends with you because of that, because this is what you see on the internet. You see them liking reels of similar things, so you kind of just don't act the way that you would in a way like that finds people that actually would like you otherwise. The validation of being liked is pretty addictive, especially when you're a man or whatever. The counterfactual is probably better. The things of like barrier of entry to like traditional media. So before social media was very big, you had like TV shows, you had movies. Those are how people kind of like learned a lot of trends and whatnot. They were a lot better because there are higher barriers to entry for the kind of content they're going to make. So you cannot make like incel movies because that costs a lot of budget. You have to have content that is accessible and popular enough or acceptable enough to a large demographic of people because that's how they make money. So you have TV shows that are more moderate in how they depict women because that's how you appeal to a women audience. You have books or whatever that the publisher tells you can't like talk about this wealth building scheme because that's going to give a bad look to us. So the content that previously existed was moderated so much better, meaning that the people who engage outside of social media just get better ideas of this. Go ahead.
So even if it's true, there's counter pressure from men within these same communities. Like if your buddy got scammed by an MLM scheme, you probably post content discussing why this is true, or maybe more actionable steps.
Yeah, but that's so lame, bro. Like that's so lame. Why would I watch like a 3-minute video of someone talking about their MLM scheme? I don't have that fucking attention span. I'd rather watch like the 10-second video of like a guy with his 8 Lamborghinis. That shit's sick as fuck. Okay, the second thing, social media leads to worse learning of social skills, even for normal men, right? First reason, social media allows people to optimally select for the communities that they feel good in. So maybe Warhammer if you're really into that, but also people who agree with you, people who have memes that you think are funny, people who send you posts, you make group chats with who send you stuff like that. But this is bad because men are bad at selecting for meaningful relationships, and people in general, but particularly men. Firstly, it's kind of difficult to identify if someone is going to be a meaningful friend or one that is going to have value to you if you're engaging with them a lot over social media. It's kind of hard to tell what someone genuinely believes about something when they send you a reel. But if you have a conversation with Aubrey about what he thinks about, I don't know, RuPaul's Drag Race or whatever, I can probably get a much better idea of what his personality is like. But if he sends me a reel, I think, haha, funny, goated Aubrey, even if, anyways. Second is that there's a high barrier of entry, or you have a fear of being made fun of. So it means that it takes a longer time for you to be talking about things that are more sensitive when you're kind of engaging in more superficial ways over the internet. I just sending like emojis or whatever. And so it just means that people kind of spend more time in these subpar relationships and finding these other ones. The third is just that if you're a man and you're anxious about making friends and having a community, you generally take the path of least resistance. So people who are going to send you those reels, people who maybe you don't have the most meaningful conversations with, but you engage with anyways on social media. The result of this is just it leads to worse relationships and social skills. The first is that you have worse feedback mechanisms. There's lots of content on the internet for you of like, finding your circle king, finding like, your like coven or whatever. But this means then that you talk to people who agree that, you calling this girl like a pick me is like, like good behavior, right? And you find people who will validate your like feelings and emotions, even when that's not something that they should be doing. And the reason why this persists is because it's really, really easy to find communities on the internet in a way that really isn't when you're primarily engaging with people in real life. So in real life, where there's kind of a more unlimited availability of people, you have more incentive to put in active effort into those relationships, or finding out the kinds of people that they are. So you can actually figure out if that's right for you. On the internet, there's so many more people on Twitter. You can just like, engage with them, or you just don't find out that they're, people that you don't agree with in the first place if you're just sending each other reels. This means you get lower quality relationships that are just good enough to satisfy discomfort and not feel lonely, but you never feel lonely enough to go out and pursue better friendships or better relationships and whatnot. The counterfactual is better. You just go to you go to your third spaces. It's better to have real discussions with people and you have material positive memories. You go do things in real life instead of just sending each other reels. I think that's much more meaningful and much better. We propose.
Very much. Member Ross.
Can everybody hear me? All right. Fantastic. All right. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. A couple of responses to closing government before we go into the round-winning extension. What does closing government say? Essentially, the first claim is that people do not have the ability to moderate social media to a significant extent. I want to point out for closing government, most of the super controversial people that they are worried about, people like Sneeko, people like Andrew Tate, have already been banned off of many social media platforms that people do engage with. But secondly, we say it's about engagement more broadly, right? So essentially, there's a vast majority of content that is dedicated to counter veiled influence of Andrew Tate. So it's not just about you seeing the content, it's about the extent that you're engaging with the content. And there's many incentives not to engage with the content, given the fact that these things are so derided on social media. But in addition to that, I want to weigh this. A lot of the stuff that CG talks about is incredibly fringe. Maybe men engage with Andrew Tate. Maybe men engage with Sneeko, but people are not going on social media to engage with Andrew Tate and Sneeko. The reason why people go on social media more broadly is to build social connection. So on weighing, the positive impacts are far more likely than the negative impacts. The fourth thing I want to note here, though, it's unclear why echo chambers develop exclusively around the realm of ideology. That is to say, the counterfactual under our side is probably people finding niche communities, but niche communities around interests that are niche, so they're far more able to relate to other people as well. So it's unclear as to why echo chambers developing is just uniquely bad on weighing. But the final thing I want to note here is they never explain to us, even in the first place, why a low quality relationship, the comfort that it provides, is somehow worse than not having a relationship whatsoever. All you get is a flimsy line from member that says, because you're lonely, you're going to go out and get social connection. That is not how social connection works, because a lot of people have social anxiety about going out in the first place, which is why they opt into easy, more comforting forms of relationships. What is the winning extension in this debate? It's going to be about flipping everything regarding how men's mental health is significantly shit in the status quo and why it gets better at the point at which people engage with social media. Important framing that nobody else in this debate actually does. What are the male issues that men actually experience? We take 3 things. Number 1, difficulty showing vulnerability. That is to say, the traditional concept that men have to be incredibly stoic. The second thing here is the security that men feel within these relationships, i.e., I think a lot of people just generally feel a great degree of insecurity within the status quo already. You see that your neighbor has more wealth than you. You see that your neighbor is more buff than you. So people already are questioning whether or not they're attractive or financially good enough for their partners. But third thing, there's an important thing rather, is that many forms of relationships seem to be liberalizing, especially for women, but the same does not appear to be true for men. That is to say, even though relationships for women seem to be liberalizing, for example, the issue here, though, is that men's relationships oftentimes still feel transactional to a significant extent. But the next thing I want to note here is that crucially, there's also culturally prescribed aspirations regarding relationships. That is to say, society tells you, and this is especially true within the status quo, where you have a close, tight-knit community, that you should have a certain kind of a partner, right? You should have a partner that is maybe the same race as you. You should have a partner who is ideally a heterosexual relationship, which society states. The point here is that many men feel anxiety that they will never have the ideal form of relationship. The important thing I want to note here is to some extent this is symmetrical, but what the teams have failed to prove, and what we're going to prove, is why social media acts as a counterpoint to all this negative shit that men have to experience. How are these norms perpetuated? I think, firstly, a lot of these norms have been internalized by men to the point that they don't question them. A lot of men see it as a personal failing if they cry. They see it as a personal failing if they show any form of vulnerability. Secondly, and crucially, it's perpetuated by other people in their life. This is how fucking norms work in the first place. We're not saying that you're going to be, if you're a partner, you see your male family member cry, you're going to shit on them, but you might still feel some subtle disgust. You might still feel in your mind, hey, dude, you shouldn't be crying about this. So a lot of this stuff is perpetuated by people in your own life. The third thing is perpetuated by traditional media, right? And here's the thing, is like to some extent, it is true that, traditional media does exist. But the point here is that everybody is exposed to traditional media. That is the problem. So traditional media has traditionally been incredibly patriarchal. Look at shit from the 1950s where men traditionally beat their wives in black and white movies, for example, right? Where traditionally you're presented this ideal form of relationship within this form of traditional media. What sucks here is that everybody's exposed to it. Nobody is exposed to other countervailing viewpoints. Why does social media ameliorate these social norms? And this is incredibly critical. I'll take OG.
Okay, so it's exactly what you're describing, right? Like when a man in real life is upset, or a woman or any person, they have facial expressions. They might be holding back tears, if not crying. These are not things you see on the internet where people curate their image of themselves. This is why social interactions are fundamentally void of learning how
I
to
don't think that's true. I don't think our claim is contingent on you, seeing if somebody else is like crying. What we're essentially going to be saying, I think I'll flag it when I get to it, but essentially it's about how social media is amenable to changing norms in some way. I think the first thing I want to note here is that more people are going to be exposed to content regarding men's mental health, i.e., this is a niche space that is more likely to be pushed by the algorithm towards men, right? And the important thing that I want to note here, though, is that what OG says is that people are going to be exposed to echo chambers. The issue with this, though, is that even if you see something for like a little bit, right? The point here is that the algorithm does not push the exact same thing to you every single time, right? Sometimes you're likely going to be exposed to things that are countervailing. You're likely exposed to men's mental health content occasionally. And what this means is the moment you see it and the moment that you're likely to engage with it because you relate to it, the more likely you are to receive this stuff in the first place. So if you buy what closing government says is that the moment you register as a man, you're going to get pushed cars and Lamborghinis, presumably the algorithm recognizes you are a man, it's going to be pushing mental health content for men to you. These things have been absent through socialization, like I mentioned. But the important thing I want to note here is this plants ideas in the heads of men and people who are in relationships with men in their life who might be struggling, i.e., people are more likely to be cognizant of the fact that men have this sort of unseen problem with things like loneliness. What this means then is that people are at the point at which they're exposed to this content are more likely to be proactive in reaching out to their male partners, be more likely to be reaching out to people in their life who might be male who are struggling. And if OG says that you might just get some kind of echo chamber, the point here is the echo chamber itself is a cry for help. What this means at the point where the echo chamber develops, people recognize this as a societal problem. You're far more likely to check in on your friend who has mental health issues because now you know those issues exist. But secondly, men are more likely to question the reasons why they do a lot of these things. A lot of these norms are fundamentally illogical. It is illogical, the fact that men should not cry, for example. At this point, social media exposes you to parts of the world that have liberalized along the lines of gender. But the next thing I want to note here is you will be exposed to a greater plurality of relationship content. Relationships do not conform to the typical heterosexual norm, or, for example, right? So you will not be traditionally exposed to just the kinds of relationships that society expects you to have. You can start embodying a lot of these things in your own relationships at the point at which these things have been normalized. So, for example, gay men who now understand that homosexuality is okay, so are more likely to embody that, oppose.
Very much. Go.
Yeah, that's just so.
Oh.
all of Offbench is trying to mitigate and counterbalance the damaging effects of social media by explaining that there's a counterfactual impact or counterfactual mechanism which explains why men are so lonely. I think that all of these reasons fail, and we're going to weigh what Rose extended to you about the lack of moderation and the negative reinforcement mechanisms against both OG, both OO and CO. So the CO case is essentially just that in response to the idea of an Andrew Tate, and in response to the idea that men face very damaging damaging content on social media, their countervailing influences that men's mental health content is going to save the day. I think that there's four responses to this. The first is that empirically, there is no left Joe Rogan. There is no left Andrew Tate. And so there is no countervailing influencer who has the same reach or stature as the kinds of networks that we're seeing on the far right. I challenge you to name one, maybe like Hassan Piker. But for Hassan Piker, I can name like 10 people on the far right. So empirically, this is bunk. Three other responses. The first one is about confirmation bias. Sure, you can issue a correction post saying the MLM scammed you, but the first one will have already gone viral and will have had huge amounts of reach. And then even if people see things later, they have a disincentive against engaging with them because they've already internalized the prior belief. And Rose provides a unique extension to you that at the moment of joining these social media platforms, they give you the most damaging content. They give you the wealth and the mansions. OG just says that they give this broadly, but I think that Rose uniquely tells you that this happens at the moment of sorting on the basis of like the gender language of the names. Two other responses. The first is very costly to these kinds of responses to inflammatory techniques. Inflammatory content is easier to create than nuanced and complex content. It takes us research to create. It takes us time and dedication to create. It's harder to pump it out than content farms, than AI tongue support or whatever. And then the last response is just that even if there are responses and even if there's countervailing
Point of
content,
information.
people, and particularly men, get sorted into echo chambers where they don't see it. Like, I don't think the kinds of people who are being negatively affected by this are like seeing woke mental health therapists on Instagram. They're not seeing this, bro. And there's no incentive for them to see it because their social networks show them similar
Point of
content.
information.
Brandon tells you that when you go on social media, you'll like see what your friends like and like you'll be exposed to other norms. But if what Hamza likes is thirst traps of women, and then that's what I see all my friends liking, then I'm being exposed to damaging things. Brandon doesn't tell you what kind of content you're being exposed to. We explain to you that this is content that is uniquely damaging to individuals and sorts people into worse and worse friend groups. And it affects both online and in-person friend groups. When you send thirst trap reels to each other, that legitimizes that the way of bonding or the form of bonding of your relationship is around things that are very superficial or potentially sexual, as opposed to, and then substitutes for other forms of meaningful engagement, because this is how you
Point of
learn
information.
and engage with other individuals. The next thing that Theo says is that when there's social media and you lower the barrier of entry, you're more likely to respond to people and reach out to people. There's two responses that we have to this. The first is just that social media also lowers the barrier to checking out. If someone is experiencing a mental health crisis and people are messaging them, it's really easy to leave them delivered and not check your social media, right? And this is as opposed to checking on someone in person, doing an intervention where you have to they are physically confined in that space. Like there's a physical interaction. And so it's more difficult to opt out of those difficult conversations. And so the kinds of conversation are different. But the second and more important response is that this is substitutive. This substitutes for more deeper, meaningful engagement that people have with individuals. And the last response that we have to the stuff about like the content is just about moderation. I think this is a unique extension that Rose provides you that is very Brown-wing and it's clearly beating both up benches. Why is the moderation stuff important? The moderation stuff and gatekeeping stuff of traditional media is very important because it determines the kinds of narratives that are set. The CO response to this is that in the 1950s, there was heterosexual media. Well, in 2004, there was Will and Grace, right? By the time of today, even without social media, these norms are likely to have progressed because people advocate for the grassroots, they communicate and they pressure these social media networks. These traditional media networks, TV producers, Hollywood, etc. And these are the people that shape the kinds of norms and things that people aspire towards. But notably, these are narrative-based forms of content that people consume, and so they have to include things like conflict, like personal character development, things like this, as opposed to on their side, the kinds of media that people consume or the kinds of narratives, sorry, things that people aspire to are literally just
Point of
like
information.
traps on thirst traps on Instagram. And so even if you desire a woman to some capacity on either way, the way in which that's channeled is different when you're just given free reign for like a race to the bottom of your dopamine sensors on either side of actually never mind. Okay. Yeah, so I think sure.
So there's a time trade-off. When you internalize existing narratives that tell you must be successful for you to be a man, you spend time grinding, finding a community of people who you like, who like the same game as you or TV show, hopping on a call and chatting about sports is much easier. You can do it at home on the bus, which means that you're actually likely to seek out friendships on our side and not yours.
You're more likely to seek out friendships because the top cost is lower. I think there's two responses to this. The first is just that people, this is substitutive because there's a time trade-off, as you mentioned, and so people trade off high forms of engagement to low forms of engagement. The second response here is that the other forms of engagement are not as cost intensive as OO would like you to believe. It's not actually that difficult to go from your work to a bar that's 10 minutes away after work to meet up with your friends and see hockey. It's not actually that difficult to seek out third spaces. OO says that like the third spaces are in decline. Two responses to this. First is that some third spaces are not in decline symmetrically for the reasons that they mentioned, because there's third spaces like bars, which are probably relevant because of modernization, but these spaces are uniquely targeted by the rise of social media because people replace going to the bars with going to watch the game at home. And what this means is that not only the people who want to do like the low effort stuff are affected, but when the bar attracts less people, more bars shut down, and therefore people who wanted to go out in person and meet people in third spaces can't do that. And I think that's really damaging. I think so people can't even opt into it when those physical environments don't exist. I think like says this when they say like, well, people don't go out, but they don't explain what the impact of this is in terms of like raising the price on businesses to continue operating. So like these third spaces shut down when they can't meet their profit margins because their economies of scale are bad. Yeah, I think that's the response to OO. I think that we're clearly beating OO in this debate. I'm not gonna lie, proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Now call on Aubrey, what does that say?
Okay, am I going first, or is that how
Yes,
this
you are
works?
going first.
Okay, great. Cool. Thanks everyone for the debate. I'll give like one piece of general feedback, and then I will just give the ranking and then like chronological justification. So I think the one piece of general feedback is that I feel like too much of the rebuttal in this debate was just like mostly mitigatory, and there wasn't enough that was like, actually just like rebutting the logic of people's arguments or like trying to flip them. So, for example, like opening government have this argument around like, uh, you get these kind of manosphere type impacts, and then like opposition teams throughout are just like, oh well, the norms for men previously were also bad, and then I'm just like, I don't really know like how to evaluate this kind of thing. I feel like this would have been like way more powerful if like there was an attempt to actually potentially just flip stuff much more so than just mitigating it, basically. I think that's like a general thing that works pretty well. Okay, so in terms of the ranking, we gave the first to opening government, the second to closing government, the third to opening opposition, and the fourth to closing opposition. And I would note that the like short diagonal was by far the closest comparison in the round. Okay, so what do we get from opening government? So opening government basically say previously men were socialized in real life and like this was substantially better. Currently with social media, algorithms have like these incentives, sorry, like social media companies and their algorithms basically attempt to like maximize the amount of time you spend on the social media platform. And they do that through things like rage bait or like prompting insecurity among men, this kind of thing. And like, or like people flexing like easy to understand solutions to your problems. And so what this means is you get things kind of like the manosphere or like clavicular and lux maxing, these kind of impacts. Um, DPM adds stuff, which is that basically like previously, if all relationships would have had IRL components, that's at least better because you at least like learn how to read people, you like get some kind of theory of mind, this kind of thing. And you lose a lot of that by just like defaulting to social media, basically. So what do opening opposition say? I think opening opposition, firstly, like most of the opening opposition case is like trying to mitigate the harms coming out of opening government. So they basically say things like, oh, well, you were getting into this trend where there was less in-person interaction anyway because of like the decline of third spaces. They say stuff about like rage bait doesn't actually motivate you to stay on social media because in fact makes you feel bad. So you instead see more positive content. You get like lots of responses like that out of opening opposition. I think that these responses are like reasonably good. So I think that like a lot of the stuff about the like, say, for example, harmful norms that existed for men before social media anyway, like does mitigate to a reasonable degree the harms coming out of opening government. I think the main reason why we didn't like give opening opposition the win over opening government is just that we don't think that their positive case like was able to basically outweigh the opening government's positive material. So the OO positive material is basically like you get more information on social media, you're exposed to like broader groups of people, and then you maybe find better communities that resemble your own. I think the biggest problem with this is just like there was much less focus, given in terms of proving this, especially when opening government and later closing government talk about how you're basically siloed into these echo chambers from very early on. It's like not clear to me how you get these like much more diverse kinds of information. Um, so at that point, I just kind of have to weigh that like good communities that you form on for men that OO talk about versus the like extremely harmful communities that OG talk about. Um, and I guess the like OG mitigation about like, positive communities for men being like kind of edge cases ends up winning out for us here. But to be clear, I think like if opening opposition had like much more rigorously proven the like benefits of, say gay communities, for example, and made that unique to social media, plausibly they could have got ahead of opening government, but we just think that they didn't end up doing that. So they ended up losing. All right, so bringing closing government. So closing government basically have like a vertical extension upon like why the communities forming from social media are really bad and like why the counterfactual would have been good. So I think their strongest contribution is about the counterfactual, where they basically say like previously when you didn't have social media, the like media and stuff that you consumed by its nature was less targeted and so had to appeal to a much broader group of people, and that meant that the messages were like much less harmful. Um, that's the stuff that they say about moderation, basically, which is that previously you had this more moderated, more mainstream form of content, and now you get things that are like way more like specific and like hyper targeted to your like to like vulnerable men, for example, and you get much less pushback or much less positive narratives, this kind of thing. There's this second stuff that they say, which is basically like, uh, you basically are in these communities that are like kind of not very good for you, but it's like kind of takes some friction to leave, and you just kind of settle for them. So you settle for your like kind of bad community on Discord rather than forming an in real life community. So how does this compare in the debate? So weighing this to opening government, I think the main thing is that like the opening government mechanisms around like rage bait and engagement seem about as good as the closing government mechanisms. And I don't think there's like that much of an effort from the closing government team to like weigh their contribution over the opening government team. So I think it's like there is new analysis in closing government, but it's not explained as being more important than the opening government analysis. And it doesn't seem like on its face substantially stronger. So at that point, I think that like closing government have to take it under opening government. Doing the short diagonal, I think that this was definitely the closest comparison in the round. So from closing government, we have these like additional mechanisms around basically why you get like harmful communities through social media. And then in opening opposition, we have like pretty good mitigation around like what the counterfactual would have been, plus this like slightly underexplained like benefit in terms of getting gay communities. I think the reason we end up giving it to closing government over opening opposition is that we think that the closing government mechanism around like moderation and the counterfactual actually ends up like getting rid of a load of the OO mitigation about like, oh, things would have been bad for men on both sides. Basically, I think closing government are able to explain why actually things would have been reasonably good for men in like the early 2000s, where you get like relatively progressive-ish media that most men are consuming, and like some IRL forms of community. And so I think at that point, I'm kind of convinced, okay, the counterfactual would have been at least reasonably good. And that I think diffuses the like main thing coming out of opening opposition, which is basically social media has like not worsened things substantially, and everything is like all the harms of the manosphere and things were explained by other factors. So I think that CG diffused the OO mitigation. There's still the OO benefit about like niche communities, but I don't think that's like I think that's less important basically than the like CG benefit around like most men being siloed into these like pretty harmful manosphere type um echo chambers. So yeah, it was very close, but that's why we ended up giving CG the win over OO. And then finally bringing in closing opposition. So I think closing opposition's main contribution is this argument that like um you get basically positive depictions of men and like men's mental health content as a result of social media. I think our biggest problem with this case was that we weren't exactly sure like why this was incentivized or who was consuming it. I think the main claim that was given was basically as a result of like fringe manosphere content, people respond to this by creating the like positive men's content. Um, I guess our questions with this were just like, well, why is this content consumed? Why is it popular? These are questions that Government Whip also raises, and Government Whip makes a pretty reasonable point that like once something has become initially viral, it's like pretty hard for the responses to gain that much traction to it, compared to the original viral thing. So how does this contribution about men's mental health compare in the rest of the round? I think comparing this to what opening opposition say, I feel like yeah, I think the main because we just like don't think that this argument is fully proven in the round. I think the like niche benefits around, for example, gay communities that opening opposition talk about to us seem like slightly more plausible and better proven. So basically the CO impact, if proven, maybe beats opening opposition, but we don't think it was proven. So we think that they lose to opening opposition. And we think they probably end up losing to government bench for similar reasons, which is basically just like we don't think this impact was that proven in the round. I think the impact of the manosphere from both OG and CG are like reasonably well proven and seem pretty impactful. And just empirically, they seem more true than the like influx of positive men's mental health content on social media. So at that point, we think unfortunately, closing opposition ends up losing. So that's why we ended up seeing it the way that we saw it. But yeah, thanks everyone for the round. We thought it was really good.
Thank you.
Thank you. We good.
Will that be a big concern?
Thank you.
Oh. He bless you. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, that's good. I don't even right on. That's not, you know, wow. Sorry.
I'm working out, not.
Apple.
I was thinking of this one class, so the way I have there two classes.
Okay, what's on the mutes?
Okay, guys, let's.
You can hear me?
Mhm.
Okay. That wasn't performative. That was actually fantastic. Okay, so we came to a call with one split decision. We ended up having OG in the 1, OO in the 2, on a very close split. This is where the split decision was, and also all 3 adjudicators said that this was the tightest split, and we spent the most time talking about the split. 3 to CG, and then unfortunately the 4 to CO. Okay, so few things that I'll say off the bat before I get into a little bit of team by team, split by split. I think that there were a few things that needed a lot more explanation in the round, and a lot of the round was talking about things that weren't characterized in the deepest ways. And so the engagement on these sorts of things ended up being a little too surface level or on things that were unproven or like downstream of things that weren't like initially proven, which then become like top heavy arguments and like easier to topple, right? So I'll get into a little bit more specifically what I mean by that. But first, let's talk about OG, their contribution. I appreciate all the framing stuff of like, you know, what is an interpersonal relationship that is good? What is a relationship period? What did things look like before social media? I think this is fairly charitable. Although like a little bit biased, but like that's what you do in debate. With like, you know, you can learn how to flirt with girls, stuff like that. We did get pushback on this a little bit, but that's fine. What does average man using social media look like? A lot of this is dictated by algorithms. What do algorithms look like? This is great. I think this sets up the round quite nicely. Yeah, but I think that a little bit of differentiation of like where the constructive lies within this could have been nice because it kind of just flowed from here. And then we got like, oh, and the implication of this, the impact of this is, oh, and then this ties back to this thing. So like solidifying your case happened a lot more in the deputy, which is fine. But like some content was dropped, and I think this was a strategic thing. And so I think the prioritization in the PM could have been done here to like save some of your time for like some more salient pushes. I think I'm going to briefly comment on the grind set thing. I'm like kind of unsure why grind set is like the worst thing for relationships of like, oh, you're just spending more time grinding. I don't know why this comes specifically from social media. The exclusivity is challenged in the round. I also like need a little bit more of a link than you're just like spending less time talking to people. Because I don't even know if this is true. There's like huge communities of grind setters who like grind together and talk about the grinding. But like even if I do grind on each other. Anyways, I think that the main case that we credit from OG that I think is very strong is the whole logically prior thing of like you don't learn how to have these good relationships because your socialization is worse, both for people who are actively using social media, both people and then people who like grew up a little bit earlier, then like went into the social media world, and then anyone who's existing in the world where like social media use is a norm. And like given that people have a lot of incentives, the max that we're given is like it's just easier to be on social media than it is to do in-person stuff. Algorithms are bad, and data, money, they're trying to like bleed you dry in every way, shape, and form. And that the market doesn't solve because network effects needs everyone to be on one site. I think that's real. And like learning how to make good relationships can't exist within the echo chambers, which are a direct product of this, like this mechanism of how like these social media companies work and platforms work in the first place because of that explanation. So that logical link is very clear and good, and that's creditable. And yeah, why isn't this a stepping stone to real relationships? Because good relationships require conflict resolution. They require like doing hard things. They require like, doing things that is hard to do even just via like text, like in words, stuff like this. You said time is used up, friend circles are all online. Then we get an impact on self-esteem, of like you can find more protective communities in person, which I find quite interesting as a point of like if in-person bullying is going to exist symmetrically, might as well have your like safety nets be also like of the same capacity that you are going to be feeling this in the first place. So I think that's also fairly good impacting there that we don't really get too much pushback from the other teams on specifically on that part. And then understanding other people, deeper interactions. Yeah, this is the whole thing that I was saying before. So basically the downstream, you learn how to have better interactions, you learn how to socialize better. And this means that your social interaction is going to be better because you're better primed to do so. What do we get from OO? A few things, and this case also changes a little bit as the debate goes on. But we get this first push on like, you're just exposed to different perspectives, and different perspectives are good. I think this is like fine. I think this is a hard argument to be comparative in when it's like, oh, or like have a margin in the comparison of, because it's like, okay, yeah, like you are getting lots of people because lots of people are on social media, but bad stuff also exists. So it's like when you're like trying to clash with the like main points of the other team, it's like when you're using something that's kind of like, ships passing in the night, this is kind of hard to weigh. The stuff that I think engages a lot better with what we get from the OG side of things is one thing that like unfortunately was not that big in your case, but like when you're engaging with the idea, this happened in the leader at the very end of like what things looked like before. You're like frat boys and CEOs and the worst men possible. I think this whole locker room culture stuff is so real. And when you're not calling it out, when you have less visibility on social media, this is a mechanism that you give why you have like more accountability. I wish this was carried through a little bit more because this is really good engagement of like, this is kind of what the world might have used to look like or could look like when people aren't doing this. This is one thing that we are actively skirting by having this, and therefore better relationships. What we then get more is the idea of like, shed life is real and like society cooked in the sense of like, there's not a lot of third spaces. There's not a lot of opportunity to interact with people. A lot of these are not because of social media. These are because of like economic factors and whatever. A lot of reasons were given for this, which is good. There's a lot of stuff on the grind set shift being parallel. I think maybe this wasn't the best like prioritization. Given that like the grind set wasn't stuff that like was round winning to us as a panel initially. But the whole idea of like social media fills the socialization gap. The alternative is more likely just like no socialization whatsoever, then this is probably bad. Even if your socialization is mid, this is better. Also, like the more salient point within this is similar interests. And this is something that I want to flag in terms of your team's interaction with the entire Gov bench is the entire Gov bench kind of predicates people's interaction with social media as inherently involuntary and like passive scrolling. You don't get to dictate anything that you're seeing. You have no agency whatsoever, which I think is the little bit uncharitable way of doing this. And what you guys are kind of bringing is like, no, there are not just scroll, and I'm not even doing anything type shit. It's like I can find a Facebook group of things that I like. I can, join a Reddit group and talk with people, or like there are different forms of social media that allow for this a lot more. And this isn't really picked up too much on GovBench. And this is what I mean of like the stuff that's a little bit unclear or left like not unpacked or characterized as much as it should be. In sort of like we get a little bit of a hazy view of like what social media is and how people actually interact with social media. You're giving us another way that people do this. And I'm going to get to this in the split next when I talk about CG, but when we're talking about like, anything that is like algorithmically driven, it's hard for that to outweigh when you're like, yes, but it's unclear what the percentage is, what the margin is, what the difference is. Like, what is the scope? How many people are like doing this thing versus the other thing? Can you have both? I think the weighing is just unclear. And so given that we have a push of like this is an alternative that is fairly salient that has like significant positive benefits. That's something that we credit quite highly as like the most important part of the opening opposition case. But we don't think we do still think this is downstream of like you're only in this position because social media exists in the first place. Therefore, OGs kind of be able to be like, okay, you would be able to make a relationship if you didn't have this in the first place. I think this is not like an infallible argument. I think locker room stuff could have been a good push on this. On CG, I personally think that calling your extension moderation was a little bit confusing to me. This is a tiny little thing because I think what you brought was a little bit more than that. Like, I don't think you were only limited to just like content moderation. I think there's a lot of interesting content that you were bringing. Of like, it's not like, I guess like for me, I was hearing moderation and then you talked about moderators. There's a lack of moderators moderating the content, but then you also talked about like self-moderating behaviors, which I guess like is like a lot of the core of this contribution of like, cringe culture. You don't want to be cringy. You don't want to be mobbed. You're going to behave in a way that is reflective of what you're seeing on social media. Validation is really important, and this is coming. So I guess like, yeah, the moderation of yourself and changing of yourself, and therefore, oh, my computer just said it's fine. You are like changing the way that you are, and therefore your like interactions and relationships are not as deep or like real or meaningful. I think this is really good, and I think this is really interesting. I think there's a few parts I would love to be able to pull it up. Maybe while talking, I'll grab my harder. But there's a few parts that could have benefited from a little more explicit differentiation from your opening. Going to do this because there's a lot of parts that were like obviously just straight up different points and different contributions, and I think OG didn't focus too much on like how people like how your in-person relations or like the way that you act personally is significantly changed, which I thought was a little bit interesting. This could have been pushed a lot, and I think this was one of the gaps that you were like really filling. I think the way that we kind of broke this split was talking about the ships passing in the night type stuff. Because I think that you struggle to engage with other conceptions of social media because a lot of your analysis, while good and we credited it, was unique to not having agency over what you were looking at to an extent. I think you talked about like other like more social mechanisms for why this is the case. And I think this is fine, but what I would have really liked and what would have like clearly pushed you over OO is understanding the extent to which things change, understanding the extent to which one norm is more important than another norm, or like one group of people or one action, one materialization of this concept is significantly more salient than the other. I think insofar as like I don't see this interaction, it's like, you can prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's like a little bit frustrating when I'm like, how does this interact with like something else that is given? And so I just felt like there could have been a little bit more responsiveness in terms of like a world's analysis. Maybe having a separate world or another world, instead of just having like your own counterfactual that you're bringing in, especially when there had been like multiple that were already put in the round. And I think you're kind of maybe a victim of the messiness of that, and like trying to carve your own path forward. But I think that disambiguation would have been quite helpful. Bringing in CO, what we get from them is this extension on men's mental health specifically. And I think while we can buy that like men's mental health is important and why this is something that like is you like specifically tied to the whole concept, with like the problem of men's interactions on social media, because men's mental health is not just like men being depressed and stuff, it's also men being aggressive and men being misogynists. And like this is, going into that, but then like making people want to be more vulnerable and how they get more vulnerability because of like some sort of like positive manosphere that exists. And you're more likely to open up to the people that you're idolizing on social media, or have them have more of a capacity over you to make you, not shit on people for crying and shit like that. I think this is a tough extension to place for a few reasons. One, because you are quite reliant on the first part of OO being that you interact with more content. Like the whole idea of like diverse perspectives, but these diverse perspectives are uniquely just men's mental health. I think like you're already limiting yourself to like exist within their framework, and then you're not giving a different explanation for why this is the case. I think you can run a vertical this way, but you need to I think like in a sense you are potentially expanding the scope of the impacts, but I think rather you're more just dialing in on one specific impact, and then the importance of this impact over the negative impacts that I also buy and credit within the scope of the round is unclear. Also, the solvency is unclear. I don't know, one, why people are actually getting access to the men's mental health specific content if like the same like reasons apply for them accessing any other type of content, positive or negative, because this stuff is going to be inflammatory to people as well. But then secondarily, why you actually get the societal change of like why people are then going to change their behaviors, change the way they act, change the way that they interact with people based on a reel that they're seeing, especially if like this is one type of content out of like 100 types of content of or like subject matter of the reels that they're looking at. So given that this is like contingent a lot on the argument that is in essence broader, on opening opposition. So this is like a narrowing of that impact without enough explanation as to why this is the tipping point. We place this under your opening. Relative to closing government, we think that they are better able to explain why you get like bad content, which is like more directly applicable to your extension, and why this manifests itself poorly societally. And then similarly on OG, what we get is why this like the societal manifestation of how people are engaging on social media, and why this needs more in person. And what we're getting from CO doesn't really engage with any of like how does in-person interaction look. outside of just like shitting on people, which we get solvency of on OG, of like you wouldn't shit on people in the first place, even though there are other norms and other mechanisms of like misogyny exists, irrespective. There's just furthering of that. And I think that's the last thing that I'll mention in this round of like alternative reasons can be given. You need to show why they have more power than the others. Like, yes, there can be societal things that make people act a certain way. If there's an other, it's not, oh, well, that can't exist because this one exists, or this one existed before that one. Show me the power and give me like a digestible way of understanding how much change you are affecting in one versus the other. And don't just do this for the one that is from your team. Do this with the ones that are coming from the other team, and place yourselves relative to this. Yeah, I also, yeah, I'm out of time, but thanks.
Thank you.